Welcome to the show. This is Brandon Wen, and you're listening to the Understanding Consumer Neuroscience podcast, brought to you by the folks at Cloud Army. In this episode, Richard talks to Rory Sutherland, Vice Chairman at Ogilvy UK, and the author of Alchemy, The Power of Ideas That Don't Make Sense. Rory discusses the power of nudging as a marketing strategy, combining the variety of efforts organizations can use to move customers towards making buying decisions. This leads to a discussion on the role of neuroscience to make those nudges more effective by understanding how people respond to the various nudge approaches. No one size fits all.
Hi, this is Richard Campbell, and thanks for listening to Understanding Consumer Neuroscience. Today my guest is Rory Sutherland, who is part of the Ogilvy Group, a vice chairman, is it?
That's right, yes, yeah. And also founder of the behavioral science practice.
And the behavioral science practice, which is very much attached to neuroscience. But also, this whole idea of nudging fascinates me. I've talked a little bit in past shows about behavioral economics, but nudge seems like its own thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in that the history of behavioral economics and behavioral science. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you ask me who the earliest behavioral scientists were, I'd answer with Aesop and Jesus.
Okay, fair.
You could look at the parable of the lost sheep as being an early lesson in loss aversion, for example.
Excellent.
And Aesop's fables, the dog in the manger, the fox and the grapes. I mean, the fox and the grapes is evidence of something called adaptive preference formation, where we tend to sort of adapt what we want to what is available.
Right.
We don't necessarily do it the other way around. But actually, we make a virtue of necessity and post-rationalize our wants according to how easy they are to acquire and so on.
Absolutely.
And also there's the vital thing of the relationship between behavior and attitude, which is a very conventional idea, is that our attitudinal change of necessity precedes behavioral change. In many cases, people change their behavior and then reverse engineer their preferences or their reasoning to fit in with their past behavior.
Well, that's certainly the system one, system two thing, that we make this instantaneous decision that we like something, and then we rationalize that decision.
As well as neuroscience, you can't escape from evolutionary psychology here, because in many cases in the ancestral environment, speed of non-catastrophic decision-making.
Right.
In other words, a non-fatal decision taken quickly is probably the best approach. A theoretically perfect decision taken slowly will probably see you dead. And the vital thing about a decision is not whether it's okay or very good. It's the difference between okay and awful.
Right.
And that's, as a result, we're hardwired, I think, for habit and social copying, because they're both reliable heuristics. Do what everybody else does and do what you've done before are both reliable heuristics to follow in avoiding catastrophe.
Yes. Wait, and to the point where we have relatively few catastrophes in modern life, but we're now operating a system where people are engineering catastrophe because it's good for business.
Go on, give me an example. I could certainly argue that COVID has brought one or two beneficial consequences. In terms of what we're doing now, by the way, the adoption of video conferencing.
Sure. Which
I think would have happened, but I think it would have taken 10 years rather than 2.
It certainly accelerated that part of it. But I do think we're seeing a lot of modern communications being you're not manufacturing a danger because it actually gets eyeballs, right? I feel like, a lot of marketing has become quite shrill, just because we're exposed to so much of it these days, that the alarmist approach seems to work.
Actually, a lot of politics is really quite alarmist, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
My argument is that I think the way I would see nudging as being beneficial is when it opens people's eyes with a reasonable degree of symmetry to the choices available to them, and leaves them then to make those choices as they see best.
And what is still natural, like, just stop trying to make them rationalize, lean on their instincts.
By the way, there are lots and lots of reasons why you don't want people all to behave like Homo economicus.
Right.
For one thing, actually, if everybody chooses in the same way, it destroys resilience in the overall market system.
Yeah.
Markets partly work because they aggregate a wide range of preferences and they aggregate a wide range of choice architectures, arguably.
And diversity is resiliency.
And diversity is resilience. And diversity also speeds progress.
Right.
Because other people do something first. In many cases, my grandparents were the fourth family in Wales to own a dishwasher.
Right.
Okay. Now, my grandparents were he was a doctor, they were quite prosperous, but they were also massively keen, for whatever reason, on labour-saving devices. Now, when they bought that thing, that was a highly eccentric, irrational decision in many ways. But it ultimately funded lots of other people to discover that dishwashers were a good idea, to a point where dishwashers were affordable to people on median income.
But yeah, and you're inevitably you end up with a stratum of early adopters, fast followers, slow followers, laggards. Like that's part of our marketing strategies too, is to recognize where are we in the marketplace, to what personalities are we going to pursue.
And the Austrian School of Economics, of course, argues that, to some extent, one of the functions performed by the rich is providing early stage funding for ideas which will then become more affordable with scale.
Right, into the mainstream.
You've probably got the same thing in Canada, I'm not sure, bigger country. Mm-hmm. But in the UK, there's this extraordinary trend for fairly high-end restaurants sending meal kits out, because in the UK you can reach pretty much the whole of the UK overnight by courier, and you can put them in a chill box with a couple of ice packs, and effectively you can get a Michelin star meal delivered to you, at 11 o'clock in the morning. It's traveled overnight. All you have to do is put it in the oven and effectively do the presentation.
And also a very popular thing from the pandemic too, when going to restaurants wasn't really an option.
The interesting thing was, I think, as with Zoom use, I think it was spurred by the pandemic because the restaurants didn't have any choice.
Yeah.
And then they discovered that, in a sense, what they probably discovered is, first of all, if you only ship your signature dishes and you only ship them once or twice a week, there's quite a lot of scale efficiency in the production.
Yeah.
Producing 1,000 portions of a Michelin-starred meal is probably a lot more efficient than making them one at a time.
Yeah, they're making them in the course of a given sitting. I also think this is very similar to the pension problem of once you got over the hurdle of correct packaging, methodology, and so forth, and you found all those efficiencies, this was a profitable enterprise. Like, this was well worthwhile and quite possibly sustainable into the future.
And disproportionately profitable in the sense that in London, you probably suffer from the fact that there's a huge amount of competition.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you're a restaurant out in the country, you've simply got a limited catchment.
Yeah, folks that are going to get there.
There's a limit to the number of people within, a range of 40 miles who are routinely going to spend £70 on a meal out. Mm-hmm. And so suddenly you've got a nationwide audience. Now,
yes.
So has everybody else, admittedly. But if you're a particularly unusual kind of restaurant, this makes quite a lot of sense. Mm-hmm. But it's interesting also because I think the pandemic this is what I would say, for evolutionary reasons, the two mega forces in human behavior are habit and social copying.
Sure.
And the reason is they're reliable heuristics that avoid catastrophe. Mm-hmm. Do what I've always done before and do what everybody else does.
Is doing. Yeah.
Because both of those are time-tested formulae, not for perfection. And this is where I would dispute the economic model, which is that the economic model assumes we're trying to optimize,
right.
But you can't optimize without perfect information.
And you never have that.
And we never have that. And we never have enough time to do the calculation and goodness knows what else. So in reality, the most important thing to do is to kind of unconsciously ask the question, what's the worst that can happen?
But also, what's good enough?
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of our marketing strategies are over-optimized in that sense. Like, you're trying to go over-optimal and you want good enough.
You're absolutely right. Mm-hmm. And also, I think we probably spend too much time as marketers trying to ladle on extra positives rather than looking for negatives to remove.
Right.
I'll give you an example. It's inordinately easier to sell someone a new car if you give them a 4-day test drive.
Yes.
Because in the 4-day test drive,
they'll talk themselves into it while they're driving.
They'll talk themselves into it. And also all their fears will dissipate. I mean, I remember being lent for 4 days, a ridiculously large Jaguar XJ. I had no intention of buying this car because it's an American-sized car, really.
Right.
And when I borrowed it for 4 days, I then discovered that with all the new reversing cameras and beeps and sensors, actually it wasn't that difficult to park a really huge car.
Right.
And I talked myself into it. I had it for 10 years. But no, you're right. And so we probably have this idea, we automatically start by adding positives. The Austrians understood this. The Austrian School of Economics understand this very well. They had praxeology, which is really the precursor to behavioral economics.
Right.
Their view in the Austrian school was that economics was the study of praxeology under conditions of scarcity. That was their definition. And they also understood, von Mises always suggested that the reason a human acts is to avoid some sense of unease. And so it was very interesting that the Austrian view of action, of human action, and the book by von Mises is called On Human Action, suggests that we have a default resting state, and what prompts activity is some form of unease.
Right. Something that interferes with that default state.
The removal of a negative is what spurs us to action rather than the acquisition of a positive. But I think it's interesting that von Mises started from that direction. But the interesting thing about the Austrians is because they accepted that value was psychologically determined, they saw marketing as creating economic value.
Sure. But is it economic value or is it perception of value?
Well, the same thing, because they wouldn't distinguish. They'd say, if you are prepared to pay for something, if that thing has been presented to you in such a way that it appeals to you to an extent that you're willing to pay $20 for it, then it's worth $20.
Right.
Whereas a mainstream economist bases their very mathematical model on the assumption of perfect information, stable, objective, transitive preferences, and perfect trust.
Yes, none of which are true.
Okay. Now, none of which applies, obviously, in the real world. And indeed, there probably were Homo economicus creatures, which occasionally roved the world, but they all were ridiculously trusting and immediately got clubbed over the head.
Or became economists, one or the other.
Exactly. They sought refuge in the economics faculties of universities, which is the only safe habitat in which someone with such ridiculous beliefs. It's rather like George Orwell's point that some things are so ridiculous only an intellectual can believe them.
So, I mean, I'm looking at these nudges and thinking it's less about nudging the benefit of the product and more about that the benefit is a lack of friction or a removal of a negative.
I mean, one thing that I think Eric Johnson has just written a book about choice. And the fact is that how you present choices to people, how you frame them, and the alternatives you present have a fairly significant effect on the choices people make. And it occurs to me that if you wanted to nudge property websites, an economist would. They're not this stupid. Okay, I'm not. This is a very unfair straw manning.
But an easy tease to make.
But an economist doesn't think it ridiculous that, say, square footage, number of bedrooms, and price are the leading search and location are the search criteria by which you look. Now, I regard this as slightly alarming because I think the job there is to nudge people into messier decision processes.
Right. I mean, I would argue that is the search criteria they start with, but that doesn't necessarily make the purchasing decision. That's two different things.
Interestingly, talking to an expert estate agent, they said, generally, when you deal with a human estate agent, he sort of knows you better than you know yourself. And humans who go to a human estate agent, as distinct from a website, will usually say, I'm looking for this, 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 and this. And here we have adaptive preference formation. What happens is you show them something which only meets 2 of those 5 criteria.
Right.
And they fall in love with one aspect which they'd never even mentioned, like a river view or a famous previous resident or whatever gratuitous thing might appeal to them.
Right. Things they didn't know they wanted. And at which point their preferences entirely reform to take advantage of what's now been shown to be available. Right.
And this guy said, a good estate agent will almost never sell the person what they said they wanted.
Right.
It worries me that when we go to a property website, we think we're finding exactly what we want, because as we go through each consecutive stage, it delivers more and more of what we've asked for. What, of course, we're blind to is the opportunity cost of not being shown things that we hadn't asked for.
We hadn't thought of. Yes.
And so, an interesting question with nudge is simply, at its best, it should present people in a manageable form with as wide a range of decisions that they can comfortably make.
Right.
And the way you achieve that is arguably perhaps by competitive advertising, where different manufacturers present their product in a different light, to a different narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't like this idea that you commoditize things and that the point of nudging is to drive greater uniformity by pushing people so that their behavior more closely resembles that of the strange creatures that inhabit economic models.
Right. It seems very backwards. Economic models were supposed to reflect us, not the other way around.
Yeah, completely right. Yeah.
But I do appreciate that you want this strategy to really be about leaning on people's natural instincts, their desires to live more comfortably.
Yeah.
And help lead them to the decision-making process.
I suppose a large part of it is that in some ways, does nudging mean you create a slightly messier choice environment?
Right.
Or does it mean you create a neater one? Now, the one school would say you make it neat so that as far as is possible, you drive people towards what I have determined to be the economically rational answer or the optimal answer.
Right, which is buy my product.
Okay, I mean, for economically optimal for you. But equally, there is a huge amount of scope for messy decision-making.
Yes.
I mean, I've made the case, for example, in transport, you want transport maps all to be different.
Well, and I guess the other question would be, does the map make the path seem more optimal than it actually is? And so making other maps.
Yes, it does. It does, undoubtedly. This is complicated.
Mm-hmm.
All that one can say is that you can significantly change behavior without changing reality.
Right.
You can significantly change behavior. For example, people's price sensitivity will all depend on what they're comparing it to.
Right.
So let's take this business where a fairly good restaurant delivers a meal to your house.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, compared to a ready meal, compared to a home cooked meal, it will seem monstrously expensive.
Yes.
On the other hand, when you go out to a restaurant, there are two slightly major constraints. One, you've got to buy their wine,
yes,
generally, which is marked up fairly significantly. You end up paying £2 for coffee. You end up paying for a load of other stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, you have to eat the whole meal in one sitting.
Right.
Now, what I noticed when you ordered a Michelin-starred meal through the post is actually you eat it over 3 consecutive days.
Right.
And you end up having 3 fabulous meals for the price of one, which might be a better use of the money.
Yeah. And certainly when you think about those high-end meals are very much the experience. The fact that you've got more experiences from it actually, I think, would increase the value even further than going to the restaurant.
Well, you could look at the peak end view and say any meal is as memorable as its best component.
Right.
So you could say, well, we have 3 meals in a row, each of which had a fabulous, memorable component.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great view on it.
It is quite interesting because we never had the option, really, of having a very small Michelin-starred meal 3 nights in a row.
No, you've never had Michelin-star restaurant leftovers ever before.
No, absolutely. So there's something there, I think, that's interesting, which is that in some ways, the limit to innovation is more psychological than it is technical.
Sure.
I think the pandemic proved that to an extent, which is the pandemic gave simultaneous normalization, social normalization, to completely new habits.
Right, to innovate.
Very rapidly, simultaneously.
Yes, there was a lot of forgiveness for everyone making mistakes while innovating.
You were allowed to make a mistake, and also consumers were allowed to experiment.
To try
much
stuff.
more than they normally would have done.
Absolutely.
Because they had a reason. I wouldn't normally do this, but I wouldn't normally order this off the internet. I wouldn't normally do this. It was perfectly obvious in 2018, 2017, that video conferencing had now reached a stage of technological maturity.
Good enough.
Where it was good enough.
Yes.
In other words, we engage in this conversation. I'm not on tenterhooks. I'm not expecting you to freeze at any minute.
Yeah.
It might happen. It does happen, but not with a frequency that's particularly painful. And what's also important is that Zoom seemed to have cracked the thing where people dropped off. People do freeze occasionally, but they generally recover.
Yeah.
So as you said, it was good enough. And it was good enough that we should have sat down at that point in 2018 and said, it is now time for us significantly to reappraise how we do business with each other.
Mm-hmm.
Because those flights to Frankfurt to attend a 1.5-hour meeting don't really make sense anymore.
Yeah.
So we need to rethink.
Well, and they never had. Now there were good alternatives. Because the other part of this that happened during the pandemic was everybody bought better gear. The largest thing was the localized redistribution of sensors for video conferencing in the home.
And of course, there are some other weird ones, which is that it's also driven flexible working in part because the home is a much better location for video conferencing than an open plan office is.
Sure.
And also, you've spotted it. This has been true, I think, for about 5 years, but people generally have better tech in their homes than they do in their workplaces.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, I always notice the fact, when I go into work, I'm looking at a laptop screen. When I'm at home, I've got a 55-inch 4K, which I use as a monitor, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. My Wi-Fi is better at home than it is at work. I no longer need to go to the office to access a photocopier the size of a bloody car or, a bank of 6 fax machines. They're now irrelevant to me.
Right.
And it's kind of a weird reflection on human behavior and psychology that we went along with the default norm, even when it was self-evident.
Well, this is inertia, right? What is the thing that lifts it over? I think a pandemic is kind of an extreme example, but all of these changes in decision-making involve some kind of inertia.
I would argue there's a very benign use of nudge, which is people tend to default to habit and people tend to default to social copying. Certain behaviors, almost like memes, just become enshrined and become habits difficult to break.
Right.
Now, one example of a nudge I've proposed, which is that when you tax your car in Canada or the US, I imagine you pay annual road tax, do you, for Canada?
Yeah, part of your insurance process, yeah.
Got it, okay. I'd put that up by a couple of $100 and I give people a couple of $100 of non-transferable vouchers they can use on trains, buses, subways,
Absolutely.
metros. Okay. Now, the point about that is, to be honest, you'd have to have an exemption for people who live in Kamloops or Medicine Hat, who didn't have much choice but to drive everywhere. Okay. But the point I'm making there is that it's a good idea to nudge people to make 1 or 2 train journeys a year and 1 or 2 bus journeys a year and 1 or 2 tube journeys a year, simply because any new behavior or unfamiliar behavior, the first 2 or 3 times you adopt it is disproportionately more painful than it is when it becomes habitual. So there are journeys that become system 1 because we've done them so often that they're cognitively very undemanding.
You just do them, yeah.
If you ever go to a new address, if you have a new client and you have to find their offices, that journey is inordinately more stressful than your commute to work.
Right.
Because you haven't automated it in your own brain.
Yeah.
And so I would argue that if you want people to make reasonably symmetric value judgments between, do I take this trip by train, by car, by bus? Do I fly and hire a car, whatever it may be? It helps for people to have a reasonably balanced repertoire of experiences, just so that they can essentially at least consider alternatives.
Right.
And, it is worth noting that, perhaps the most innocuous use of nudge is directing people's attention to an alternative that they otherwise were unaware of.
Wouldn't have seen, yes.
Okay, let's take the Nespresso machine. What's weird about it is that Nespresso coffee is a lot more expensive than Folgers or Maxwell House.
Right.
And if you look at it as a direct comparison, it makes no sense at all. But equally, if you look at it as an alternative to Starbucks, an espresso machine is really quite cheap.
Yes.
And so there are two, and you cannot really privilege one viewpoint over another, can you?
No.
I like my Nespresso machine because it saves me from having to spend $2.80 at Starbucks, or I find my Nespresso machine ridiculously expensive compared to instant coffee prepared from granules at home.
Right.
They're both valid ways of looking at things. I would argue that if you encourage people to look at something in more than one way, they might arrive at a better decision than if they go with the flow of their default comparison.
Right. Still, it's a question of you're making a more rational decision.
Mm.
Where does neuroscience fit into nudging? Like, why they seem adjacent, but they're not the same thing. Like, where do you do testing?
Now, Daniel Kahneman, who's the sort of godfather of modern behavioral economics, says that had he been 20 years older, he would have switched to becoming a neuroscientist rather than a behavioral economist.
Right. Because
he sees that as the area where most potential lies.
At this time.
Yeah, at this moment. I'm not sure you can, yes, I think it can inform us, but ultimately I don't think there's a substitute for experimentation.
Right.
And for really good data analysis to see what people do in a real world situation.
And a neuroscience test is an experiment.
Yes.
With analysis.
There are some questions around some of the measurement, which is that the calibration of the machine seems to have quite a lot of bearing on the results which it actually reveals.
Sure.
There are very interesting findings from neuroscience. For example, when people buy a familiar brand, far less of their brain lights up than when they buy something unfamiliar, which is interesting because it suggests that the purpose of advertising might be just normalization.
Yes.
Make the thing a system one decision.
Well, then this is where you get into the famous scenario with the orange juice, where they altered the brand enough that people didn't recognize the product anymore.
Yeah, and they also broke a very interesting kind of semiotic convention, which is in the UK, I can't speak for everywhere else. Mm-hmm. In the UK, if you show the fruit, it suggests it's the fresh juice.
Right.
And if you show the liquid, it suggests it's the long life variant.
Right.
Okay. So what, for whatever reason, at least to UK audiences, Tropicana redesigned their fresh orange juice packaging, which went in a fridge, using to some extent the conventional imagery of less fresh, long life, pasteurized or whatever it is, orange juice.
Right.
And so they devalued it by that because people were accepting that you paid a significant premium for the fresh pressed variant,
right?
But with bits in over the what you might call the processed long life alternative.
Yeah, it is fascinating, and the fact that they got to put stuff on the shelves and had the impact on, like, talk about an expensive test as opposed to have been validated that in research and adjusted before it went to the shelves.
Yeah, and that is the kind of thing where I often describe what we do as the science of knowing what economists are wrong about.
Right.
But it's also the science of knowing, or at least hypothesizing, what market research can't tell you. Mm-hmm. And market research can't tell you much about what price people will pay because they'll always game the system by, saying as low as possible.
Right.
Or they'll always try to appear completely rational.
There is no survey method for pricing that works, but there are neuroscience methods that will help you determine pricing.
Yeah, and there are also probably patterns where you can meaningfully experiment. Mm-hmm. There are cases where it's probably not worth experimenting. But I would certainly say that just because something coheres with research findings and coheres with a kind of economic logic, e.g., if you drop the price, you will sell more, that is more likely to be true than not, but it's still not a safe assumption because, of course, the discovery that if you put the price up, you sell more is a rarer discovery, but it's so much more valuable.
Yeah, when it is right, it's very, very valuable. But we've also seen the cases where when a price drops below a certain threshold, sales drop off because people devalue it.
We saw an interesting case, actually, where British sparkling wine, which is as good as most champagne. I'm scandalizing your French.
Oh, yeah. No, the French are all shocked now.
But it's very similar soil. It actually reappears the other side of the channel. Mm-hmm. So Epernay and so forth and Reims have fairly similar soil to the southeast of England and parts of Wales, in fact. And the problem is, of course, that champagne is largely bought for the fact that it is known to be more expensive than ordinary wine.
Right.
There are three particular cases where you may want to spend more. You may want to signal generosity by giving it as a present. You may want to signal generosity by serving it as a host. Or you may want to mark an occasion.
Right.
This is your birthday. This is my birthday. This is a special occasion. And we mark this occasion in the same way that I've always said I don't know if I'm right in this entirely, being a bloke, but I've often said to female correspondents, if you went to your best friend's wedding, in reality, no one would notice if you went online and bought a very nice dress for, 90 Canadian dollars or 150 Canadian dollars. But the fact is you don't, because the psychology of a special occasion or a treat says that would not be commensurate in expenditure with the significance of the occasion.
Sure. And the trick to using British sparkling wine at a celebration is don't show the bottle, right? It's bubbly in a glass. Good enough.
Well, what they did is that didn't work if you're giving it as a present. It didn't.
Right.
Normally, we would serve wine with the label visible. You could cheat it that way. I agree. But what was interesting is there was a guy from Heineken who took over one of the vineyards, and he did improve quality a bit. It's not fair to say it was purely a marketing ploy. But he also ramped the price up to champagne prices.
Right.
Actually, slightly more than champagne, if anything. And so it established this as something
as a premium.
As a premium. But equally, there may be other things, far more banal things where, I can put it in a very simple way. Okay. Some people say that the United States and the UK, where car fuel economy is designated in miles per gallon, tends to cause people to underplay and undervalue the value of moving from a gas guzzler to an ordinary car.
Right.
Because the difference between 12 and 16 miles to the gallon seems relatively trivial, whereas the difference between 50 to 60 miles to the gallon
seems huge.
Seems much bigger, even though in proportionate terms, the one is half the other.
Right.
Okay. Now, in Canada, you presumably do litres per 100 kilometres,
yes.
Do you? Under the malign French influence of decimalising everything. That is a better measure because it is proportionate to the fuel used to cover a certain distance.
Right.
Well, what's interesting about those two things is that one is literally a direct derivative of the other. Okay. They are the same thing.
They're the same thing.
Expressed in a different ratio, right? Now, in the same way, there's a very interesting guy who makes the point that if we had cars and our speedometers said minutes per 10 miles rather than miles per hour,
right,
we would drive in a totally different way. Okay. So what I think we prove with those two instances is that even when the information you provide to two people is mathematically identical, okay, in other words, with a simple calculator, you could easily derive one from the other. There's no additional information provided. People's response to that information is not objective.
Right.
And so it all depends on whether you're comparing the distance with the fuel or the fuel with the distance.
Yes. And it will affect behavior.
Now, interestingly, one thing that did affect behavior with me is when I got a sat-nav. Now, some people thought some governments tried to get TomTom and Garmin to remove the live estimated departure time because they thought they were encouraging people to race.
Right.
In other words, oh my God, I'm going to be 5 minutes late. Let's go and welly it.
Right.
It's not making a difference. Now, interestingly, if two people presented with the same fact in two different statistical modes will respond to that information in totally different ways, okay, then what you have to say is we're being nudged either way.
Right.
Okay. And therefore, looking at the extent to which people are presented with information that allows them to make useful, good enough decisions based on a reasonable formulation of available information is inherently a challenge because we don't perceive the world objectively. And this is what a lot of my talks have been about.
Right.
Don't bother making trains faster. If you put Wi-Fi on the train or you put entertainment on the train,
yes,
nobody minds.
No.
Uber solves the problem of waiting for a taxi with a map.
Yeah.
Because if you can see where your car is,
you don't mind waiting.
You don't really mind waiting.
Well, and the failure of Concorde versus the A380 is the example, right? Cutting the time in half doesn't matter if the seats are comfortable enough.
I mean, the A380 has also failed in a way.
Yes.
It was the 747 and to some extent, I think, the Dreamliner and the A350.
Yeah, the 350 and the Dreamliner are the modern aircraft.
Yeah. And the interesting thing about those is they're pretty economical.
Yes.
But this was a classic case where the efficiency mindset was allowed to triumph over human psychological preference. And the efficiency mindset said that, okay, major airports have constrained landing slots. What we're going to have to do is effectively we're going to have the entire world's air system is going to operate on a hub and spoke model.
Right.
Where nearly all journeys you take, unless you're going London, New York, will involve a change of planes.
Right. And
Boeing's bet was a psychological bet. The A380 bet was it's all about consolidation.
Yes, the ultimate hub and spoke aircraft.
The ultimate hub and spoke aircraft. It's all about consolidation. Haul them all in once a day in a massive plane, and then they'll all disperse. Boeing's bet was more of a psychological bet, which is, to be absolutely honest, people, particularly, okay, the people who fly the most tend to live next to large cities.
Right.
And they've got used to flying direct. I have to admit, okay, if someone invites me to a speaking engagement, my first question is, do I have to change planes?
Yes. Is there a direct flight or not?
Because if you've got to change planes, there's double the chance that something goes wrong. Yep. You're stressed about the connection. You can't really sleep. Ultimately, Boeing made the right bet,
yes.
I think.
But they also dealt with reducing the concentration, right? Using more secondary airports. It's a brilliant solution, and clearly it's panning out. More smaller aircraft that are more comfortable flying to more destinations.
So BA's great success is what they call thin routes, which would be, I'll give you an example, New Orleans, Austin. Interesting question. Do they fly to Calgary? I don't know. That Calgary, London would be a kind of, I think actually Air Transat do it.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, but that would be a classic thin route, Nashville, that's another thin route. London, Nashville. It's amazing, by the way, how excited the people in Nashville are when they discover they can actually fly long haul without having to change in Chicago.
Now have to go to Chicago or New York. It's fascinating. We got to put a bow on this, Rory. Talk to me about the creative side of all of these nudges and how we pull all these things together.
First of all, it's worth noting that a nudge is probably okay, although we've got to be careful about this, if it encourages the person to make a different decision which they subsequently don't regret.
Right.
Now, that's a very complicated thing because it's a bit of a low bar because we tend not to regret our decisions anyway. We tend to post-rationalize. It's called sweet lemons as opposed to sour grapes.
Right.
Sour grapes is when you decide you didn't want something you can't have, and sweet lemons are when you try and look for the positive in something you've ended up getting.
Right.
You know, my 5 years in a state penitentiary were a really formative experience. That's kind of sweet lemons.
Great for my workout routine.
It was great. Exactly. Yes. I would never have got this exciting range of body art. So that's a difficult one. But generally, if you encourage people, I think, to think a bit more widely about decisions so they don't fall back exclusively on habit, but also you make good decisions, not necessarily perfect decisions, but if you make good decisions easier to choose. Okay. So when I made the point about do I buy a hat or do I put £250 into my pension, I think you've got to acknowledge that free market retail and capitalism have pretty much cracked the pissing it up the wall activity.
Right.
Whereas the saving money activity is still dominated by massive bureaucracy, paperwork. I'd have to write a check to top up. I don't know where my checkbook is.
Once a year, I write a check.
It's like some weird nostalgia thing.
Next you're going to ask me to fax it to you.
Who are those people who reenact Civil War battles? It's like that.
The cosplayers, right? That kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. It's completely weird. So, it's interesting. And so we can, I think, reasonably ask the question when choices are presented in a way that disproportionately discourages people from thinking of alternatives, then there is scope for a nudge.
Right.
So in that sense, I'm simply in favor of marketers saying, how can we present this thing in a way that makes its value most salient?
Right.
That's really what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
In other words, and equally, how can we diminish fears? An interesting one about fears. How do we remove the unease and anxiety that people feel about a particular course of action? Now, in one case, electric cars in Britain, not Canada, not the US, not Australia, but in Britain, range anxiety, at least in a year's time, is pretty irrelevant.
I've found most folks who got electric cars even here.
Even in Canada.
Within a few months, once they understand the it's like range anxiety is not that big of a deal. It is a perceived anxiety. It is not, nobody's been stranded.
No. And actually, I imagine that most of your long distance drives, you go up to Whistler or something. How far is that?
4 hours drive.
4 hours. So, I imagine it's not that difficult to charge a car in Whistler, or there are probably a few.
Well, and there's several stops along the way, too. So it's not like it's an empty highway.
But even so, in the UK, it's even more irrelevant than in Canada.
Yes.
Because also we've got high-speed trains. So if I had to go to Manchester for the day,
you take the train.
I probably wouldn't drive anywhere. I'd take the train, you see. And so actually, one of the things we need to do is, I think we'll end up with everybody in Britain buying a car battery that's one size too big for their real needs.
Yes.
And so that's a case where actually, we've inherited the fear, not unreasonably, from Americans. Americans don't get, you've only got 110 volts, haven't you? And you're domestic. So we got 240. With 240 volts, if you visit your grandmother and you plug into a 3-pin plug here.
Yeah. You're going to get some charge.
Overnight, you're going to get yourself 90 miles, which will take you to the nearest rapid charger, minimum. Okay. In the US, you have got a bit of a problem if your grandmother only has a kind of 110 volt power supply.
Yeah. You're going to get a couple of percentage points overnight.
Yeah, it's going to be pretty dismal. There are lots of, for various reasons, the country being very small, the population density being very high, the fact that actually, if the chargers on one motorway are out of order, all you've got to do is drive 10 miles at a right angle and you'll find another charger. Though, that's not true if you're driving across the Arizona desert. Or,
No, if you make a wrong turn in the Arizona desert, it'll take a few months to find your body.
Exactly, yeah. So if you're 90 miles or 120 miles east of Flagstaff or something, right, there it's a problem.
Yeah.
And what's happened is the same fear has been inherited by Brits who operate in an environment where it isn't really very relevant.
No, not likely.
So that would be a very interesting case of what you might call, how do we nudge people to getting smaller batteries? Mm-hmm. How do we get people to relax effectively?
Is anybody incented to do that? The car company makes more money with the larger battery anyway.
I know. But equally, there's a large amount of unnecessary rare earth materials probably being consumed.
Sure.
It is strange, by the way. It's worth noting, and this is a weird statistic, 95% of journeys are under 60 miles.
Yeah, very short, right? The whole city car makes more sense than anyone wants to admit.
But there is a weird statistic that the longest 3% of journeys account for 30% of miles driven.
Right, because when the journey is long, it's really long.
It's really long. So that may be a case where actually, if that is partly a small number of people who drive insanely long journeys,
right, there
may be a case for leaving those people with petrol engine cars.
Sure.
Actually,
now you're in the median versus average trap, where if you look at the average, this is much further, but it's 60% of journeys less than 6 miles. How big your battery pack is just not that important.
It's not that important.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. Yeah. And also, by the way, in the UK, there's another factor, which is it never gets viciously cold.
Right.
Okay. Now, in northern Canada and Minnesota, people with electric cars do find a range problem when it hits kind of minus 30.
Yeah.
Actually, in Vancouver, we
don't get that cold.
You kind of get a British climate in the Pacific Northwest, don't you?
Very much. Yeah. More rain than snow.
Yeah.
But your point's well taken that the batteries have to maintain the temperature of the car too. And so they lose range when the temperatures get dramatically colder.
And you turn the heater on and you lose even more range and so on and so forth. So it becomes a little bit of a problem. This is the kind of interesting thing where what tends to happen is people have now become fixated on range.
Right.
It's rather like the early days of digital cameras where everybody talked about the number of megapixels. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And so people just become fixated on one metric. And actually, if you can wean people off that, now, I mean, the irony is that digital photography is all about software, really. It's not about the sensor, is it?
The sensor's good enough now, it doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. So, you get that point where, of course, rather like Apple, where the screen is of such a high resolution.
Apple's the one who did this best. They stopped talking about resolutions. They started talking about retina displays, as in
beautiful.
This is a resolution as good as your eye can see.
Spotify did the same thing when they set out to reduce the buffer time before a track started playing. And they stopped bothering to improve it at something like 125 milliseconds.
Right.
Because they said any lower than that and the human brain can't actually tell the difference.
You don't know it's that.
It's effectively instantaneous.
Yeah.
So don't bother. We can make it better, but what's the point?
Yeah, you don't care. It doesn't matter at all.
You don't care. And that's also true of lots of metrics, because whenever we present something numerically, we are in fact biasing it.
Yes.
If you see what I mean. Because the brain will assume that there's a kind of linear relationship between the metric and the utility.
Mm-hmm. The larger number is always better, whether it is or not.
And sometimes there's the law of diminishing returns.
Sure.
Sometimes there's the opposite. I always laughed. I went through the 80s and 90s and early 2000s when airlines in business class competed on the level of recline. Do you remember that? And they go, and our seats reclined by 130% or whatever it was, like 130 degrees, right? And then, of course, the flat bed came in, and everything else was also ran.
Yes.
Okay, because really, there are only two comfortable ways to sleep. You can sleep in a chair and you can sleep in a bed.
Right.
Generally, I've never seen anybody go and say, I'm feeling a bit tired. Let me go and recline at an angle of 170 degrees.
Except the 170-degree chair? Okay, I'm going to take a nap there.
I'm going to take a nap there, not the 160-degree chair. That's no good at all.
Yeah.
So in some senses, a lot of this is design thinking. It's simply presenting information or presenting products, because you can extend this to new product design, in a way that's commensurate with the way humans perceive things.
Right.
In other words, it's optimized for perception, not optimized for some engineer's metric.
Yeah, well, it is a strategy of marketing to compete on a number you can win at.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it's actually a great strategy long term,
No.
that the changing the metric entirely, doing the retina display thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like, because you also discredit everybody trying to measure by the number too. They instantly just go, this is a better way to measure that. I think it's a very interesting aspect of marketing. It's like, are you controlling the narrative there?
But an interesting question would be, what if instead of the range, because the range is very inexact.
They're all lies.
They're all lies.
Yeah.
If you actually said you get X hours of driving.
Right.
Okay. Well, once you said to someone, this gives you 7 hours of driving for a full charge, you go, well, I'm not going to bloody drive for 8 hours a day, right? And immediately the problem when presented to you in the shape of distance has diminished completely when it's presented to you in the, let's face it, okay, if I'm going to drive for 8 hours in a day, I'm going to stop for an hour and a half to have a meal.
Yeah. And it's a pretty good time to charge.
And that's a pretty good time to charge and so on. Yeah.
How very fair. Rory, so much fun to talk to you. It's a great tour through thinking around this modern behavioral science and the nudging meeting neuro.
Well, the way I frame it very simply is we design door handles and steering wheels to fit with our evolved bodies. So we didn't evolve hands to steer cars. We've designed steering wheels to fit with the hands we've got.
Right.
Now, in the same way, we should design information and design choices to work with our evolved psychology and our evolved perception.
Yes.
We don't design chairs simply on how much weight they can take. We design them around the shape of the buttock or the arm. And we put the height of a door handle as a handle where short people and tall people can all just about easily reach it. And yet when we design systems, we hand them over to third parties who think that how you measure them is the important thing.
Right.
But the human brain doesn't really judge things that way.
No.
It doesn't judge things in that objective way. That's what scientific implements and measurements and instruments are for. They're for an objective form of measurement that aids calculus. But evolution hasn't given us that kind of perception. I mean, we know that temperature, right? Feels like, okay? So there's a temperature, which is the objective temperature. And then there's a kind of thing that takes account of humidity and breeze, which is what it feels like.
Yeah.
We accept the fact those two things are not one and the same.
Right.
And that's, by the way, true with finances, by the way. I mean, do you really want to optimize your wealth? I mean, it's a perfectly serious question, okay?
Yeah.
I've had friends who've been very rich, okay? And there's a little bit of me which goes, as far as I can see, you've reached this level of wealth, which bizarrely means you spend more of your time worrying about money. Which is a complete negation of the whole point of being rich.
No,
right?
That was the point.
Yeah. Now they're spending all the time going, well, I'm only getting 1.7% on my so-and-so guilt fund this. Well, surely you're missing the point here.
Weren't you supposed to not worry about it?
Yeah.
But it speaks to then that you understand the way that people receive these things and market accordingly.
Yeah. And by the way, it also understands the distinction between the average and the reality. So 10 people doing something once are not the same as one person doing something 10 times.
Sure.
So don't solve for the average.
Yeah. It's almost never correct. Yeah.
Solve for the extremes.
I really appreciate that. Rory Sutherland, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure. See you soon.
And we'll talk to you next time on Understanding Consumer Neuroscience.